Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Junkyard Dawgcast. I'm your host, Jordan Hill. Got the whole crew with us, Kipp Adams and Ben Wolk, on a Monday night. We are mixing it up a little bit for a couple different reasons. One, because Georgia has been super busy on the recruiting trail, gotten several commitments since we last recorded on Tuesday. But two, if you're watching this live, we're a little bit under an hour before Game 3 of the Super Regional between Georgia and NC State. The Bulldogs trying to get a spot in Omaha, the College World Series. That would be the first time since 2008. If you're watching this, you can see I'm at home. I'm not mixing up anything, not messing with the juju. I'm keeping the momentum and staying away from Foley Field. Things did not go very well when I was there on Saturday. But Ben, let's jump in this right from the top. It has been a super productive few days for Georgia. Several commitments, several high-profile commitments, especially when you look at this upcoming class in 2025. And I'll just sort of put it on a tee for you. Just tell us what you've thought of what Georgia's done in the last few days, the guys that they've landed in this 2025 class, and how it's shaping up as we go through the rest of the summer.
Well, as we know, this is just the time of year where we can expect this type of thing on a pretty regular basis. I mean, we said coming into the official visit window that, Georgia was at that point, I think 8 or 9 commitments, and that, by the end of the summer, they would have filled out probably all but a few spots going into the season. And so, coming out of last weekend, landing 5-star linebacker Zaden Walker out of South Georgia, someone that, Georgia has wanted as their top linebacker or one of their top defensive prospects overall, all recruiting cycle long. He finally decides to go public and say that he wants to be in Georgia's class. That was a huge recruiting win, and I think it set the stage for the next few rounds of visits. We already saw coming off of this most recent visit weekend, Christian Garrett from nearby Prince Avenue Christian. He's in Georgia's class. He's someone that had a July 20th official visit or a commitment date scheduled where he was going to have a commitment party. And he comes on a visit and decides, you know what? I don't need to wait. I don't need to have that. I'm ready to shut it down and commit to Georgia. Something sort of similar happens with Todd Robinson. We've talked a lot recently about Todd Robinson, the athlete from Valdosta, who Georgia liked as a running back. They sort of liked as a receiver. It looks like he's going to play primarily defensive back when he gets to Georgia. That's how he camped a couple of weeks ago. That's how he was getting recruited. I will say, just one little note, Todd Robinson this past weekend did have a meeting with Kirby Smart and Mike Bobo where they did talk about a couple of concepts or ideas of how they think they might be able to utilize him on the offensive side of the ball as well. So offense is not completely in the rearview mirror, but he really is being recruited to Georgia as a defensive back right now. Again, he did not feel the need to wait much longer, even though he had said publicly that he might wait into the football season. Georgia kind of pushed for that commitment, and he did not hesitate when they did so. So those 3 high school commitments, huge for Georgia's 2025 recruiting class. And again, I think that as we look towards this upcoming weekend, the following weekend, and really as we turn the calendar into July, there are going to be a lot more commitments where that came from for Georgia.
Before I throw it to Kipp, I wanted to get your thoughts on this, Ben. It seems like it wasn't that long ago that people were looking at the 2025 class, seeing it. I think it might have been 10th, 12th in the country. Oh, should we worry? Should we be concerned? I mean, don't you feel like the last few days should have kind of put any of those issues, any of those concerns to rest?
No doubt. And I'll give, our Dawgs 24/7 subscribers some credit too, because I've done some Q&As recently and they've have asked, can Georgia be the number 1 class this cycle? Like, do you see Georgia as a top 3 class this cycle? And I think that despite the fact that Georgia was down in the 12, even in the teens at times early on this spring, they saw, our coverage over at Dawgs 24/7, 60% off sale going. Feel free to check it out over there right now. But they saw our coverage throughout this whole spring. They saw a lot of guys that we have written about as likely candidates to land in this Georgia class. And so I don't think that there has been a lot of fear going on, this spring, because I think they realized what was coming down the road for Georgia. And I think we've only scratched the surface of what we're seeing there. Like, again, I think that there is so much more going on behind the scenes. There's been so much more success that Georgia's had from these first 2 weekends than just these 3 public commitments. Again, those are huge recruiting wins for Georgia, but there's so much more to come as well. And so, yeah, to answer your question, I think Georgia is looking at the top of the leaderboard for this recruiting class. Like, I really do think when we look at the team rankings in December, is Georgia going to be number 1? It's hard to say that here at the beginning of June, but are they going to be pushing for that spot? Absolutely. When you think of some of the guys that they have on their board, I mean, I just wrote last week about the 5 stars that Georgia's still in the mix for, and there's a lot of them. I mean, even this past weekend, they had DJ Pickett on campus, who coming into the weekend, I basically wrote off as this is a guy that's taking a visit. I haven't written much about him, but then talking with his dad and other people around this recruitment afterwards, like, he's definitely considering Georgia. And so there are people that could land in this class that would give Georgia, just the same type of class that you've grown accustomed to seeing in the Kirby Smart era.
I want to make sure and throw in this comment from David Williams. We are Georgia red hot right now. I think that's a pretty accurate assessment of how things are going. Also want to shout out Shahid Huckabee and Goat Dog on YouTube. We appreciate you guys watching live. Kipp, what do you make of the recent haul for Georgia? The fact that they've loaded up with some really talented guys, and you look at the different guys at different positions. I mean, they've helped answer some pretty big needs when you look to the 25 class.
Yeah, big time. I mean, Jordan, we were talking about the temperatures for this coming up weekend. I think that's kind of right there in tune with Georgia's recruiting right now. It's definitely heating up, and we kind of point to this month every year. This is when you kind of lock down the majority of your class now. And right now, Georgia's got 12 commits. You got to think about the fact that that's not even close to half, of where this class is going to be when all is said and done. They're going to have 27, 28 guys at minimum. And I think the guys that they just added, Ben and I have talked about Todd Robinson for several months now. That guy's, he's just one of those you figure it out later guys. And early on in his recruitment, we were plugging him in Georgia's class as a running back, but we said he's an athlete. He can play multiple positions. He works out for Georgia. Boom. He's high on the DB board. That should surprise no one. He's just that level of player. I mean, he plays quarterback for Valdosta, is a dual guy as far as 1,000 yards passing, 1,000 yards rushing. I mentioned in the article last week, he just kind of reminded me of Bakari Rambo, just that guy that was playing quarterback at 7-on-7, but obviously made a ton of plays at Georgia at the safety position. That's kind of where I like Todd Robinson as well, as a guy that he could play star, but I think definitely would fit right in at safety. And they've had some other guys similar size, 5'11", 195. I mentioned on the board, you look at guys like Chris Smith, Javon Bullard, Tyke Smith, those guys that, had similar frames and just made a ton of plays in the secondary. I think Todd Robinson's just fits right in with that South Georgia guy. You just plug in, you don't worry about it. You know that he's going to help your program in a number of ways. The fact that they mention offense, sure. Again, he has that kind of ability, maybe on special teams. If you need a player to, sure. But I just think the way Georgia's offensive recruiting is going, you probably aren't going to need a guy like that to really help you out too much on offense, unless he just really wants to have a player to a chance to get in late in the game. And then Christian Garrett, that's just the kind of recruitment that, I guess 8 to 10 years ago, Clemson would win that one. And you'd be wondering, how did Georgia let this guy get out of their backyard? And well, they didn't even, it wasn't even close to that in this recruitment. Georgia locked this guy in from the beginning. He was a priority from the start. There was no missed evaluation here. And at the same time, you also have to know that a lot of times when you have the guy in the backyard, sometimes they want to get away. And luckily for Georgia, that wasn't the case with him. He just went where he felt the most comfortable and where he thought he's going to be developed. And Georgia now is developing defensive linemen as, just like Clemson used to back when they were taking guys out of the Peach State. So I know a lot of people are talking about, Elijah Griffin, Justice Terry. Those are big time recruits that Georgia, is in great position to land, but I think Christian Garrett's just one of those guys that I think in the end, when the evaluation process is over and the recruiting industry looks at him, he's going to be a top 10 defensive lineman. I just think he brings a lot to the table, and I just love his frame as well. So I think those are huge additions for Georgia. I really like the momentum they have right now. And a lot of the guys that haven't committed from this past weekend, they have some big time momentum. And I think especially the safety position, you think of, Eric Winters and DJ Pickett. Those are guys that could, again, play anywhere in Georgia's secondary, not guys that have been projected, I think, to Georgia by anyone really. But they're serious contenders for both those guys. So I just think we've talked about secondary recruiting this cycle as just kind of being the most fascinating because it was the hardest to pin down with two new coaches where Travaris Robinson and Dante Williams had guys on their board. I think following a lot of the in-person workouts, it's even more interesting. I think there's been a lot of movement, but also just them getting momentum with a lot of recruits that just weren't projected to Georgia earlier in the cycle.
Then I want to make sure too, especially because this happened last week, we haven't recorded since then. And I think that it kind of is easy for us with how Georgia has recruited linebackers to say, all right, they got another 5-star, let's move it along. Let's talk a little bit about Zaden Walker. I think it's just way too easy to write off, oh, they got another good linebacker. I mean, from everything I've seen, this guy is special, and he's somebody that I think Georgia fans should be paying attention to and should be really excited about.
And he's also someone that if, however you want to define the term committed, that's probably, other people have different definitions for it. He's probably been committed to Georgia since last fall. I mean, the conversations that he's had with Georgia, letting them know his intentions to want to come play for Glenn Schumann and want to come to Georgia has been very clear to Georgia for quite a long time. I mean, I think I went and saw him in October of last year, and he made that, pretty clear at that point in time as well. You never say anything's out in recruiting. You always want to be aware of the Miami or the South Carolina push that's coming throughout the spring. But I think it's pretty obvious that of all the guys that came and visited that first weekend, you had all these guys, all these 5-star, 4-star, blue chip, big time Georgia prospects. Everyone on that visit is super high on Georgia's board. And only one public commitment has come out of that, and it was Zaden Walker. And I think that there's a couple reasons for that. One is, like I said, he's sort of known for a while how he was trending. But two, I think that, Georgia realizes how important that a guy like that is to a class, how important, someone with his skill set, he's just really wired the right way. Like, you talk to this guy for 15 minutes, and he is a Georgia guy through and through. You see exactly why Kirby Smart and Glenn Schumann love this guy. And so, yeah, to your point, it's become almost second nature. Oh, Glenn Schumann got another 5-star linebacker. Oh, Glenn Schumann pushed for this linebacker and he got him. Like, yeah, that's become just part of the annual ritual for Georgia recruiting. But you're right. Zaden Walker is a very special player. He's from South Georgia. I think just not, diverting too much from this topic specifically, but I mean, this is going to be I don't want to say historic class and then get shot down by historians saying that there have been all, X, Y, and Z years or better examples of in-state Georgia recruiting classes. But I think this is going to go down as one of the best Georgia in-state recruiting classes that there's been. And I think there's a few reasons for that. When you look at 5-stars like Zaden Walker, Elias Williams, Elijah Griffin, Justice Terry, Isaiah Gibson, you look at Christian Garrett, Todd Robinson, Kevin Wynn, Dontrell Glover, like all these players in the state of Georgia that Georgia has recruited really, really well this cycle. They clearly saw that Mason Short, obviously already in the class. I don't want to leave guys out that have already committed, but just the idea that this class in the state of Georgia is really, really strong. I also think this is a whole nother discussion, but it makes me wonder, does Georgia, have they shifted maybe some of their philosophies on in-state versus out-of-state recruiting because of the transfer portal and because of relationships and things like that? I can't say that for sure based on this cycle. I think it's just, a data point for us to be able to look and see, is this a trend or is this just a really stacked class across the board at just about every position. I was going to say other than defensive back, but you bring Todd Robinson into the class this cycle from in-state as well. And, you really across the board, Georgia could probably build a class just from in-state guys.
Yeah, when people talk about how good of a job the Georgia job is, a big piece of that is what you can do in state, regardless of trying to even go out of state. So this is one of those years that proves that point that, it doesn't make it a walk in the park because there's a whole lot of teams that are going to come into Georgia and try to pull talent and will pull talent. But when you win the way Georgia has in recent years, keeping those guys home, it's going to be a whole lot easier. Wanted to make sure too and mention, we've talked about all these 25 guys. Georgia also added a guy that's going to be joining them this fall, and it's former Oregon defensive back Colin Gill. Gill had entered the transfer portal after spring practice. It looked like he was going to go to Temple, and Georgia gets him instead. 6 foot, 215 pounds. He's got 4 years of eligibility left. Watched a little bit of his tape from high school there at St. John's in Washington, D.C., and I liked what I saw. I think he's a guy from what I've watched, very versatile. I think that they can try to put him, at corner, maybe work him at star, see if he can give them some necessary depth. So I think it's one of those situations. Again, he's not a guy that Georgia recruited when he was coming out of high school. Oregon was a big offer. He had some other big ones too, like Michigan and Washington. Just didn't really get in the mix in his only season at Oregon, although it was pretty interesting. He had 2 interceptions in a fall camp practice, and Dan Lanning was, I was reading some of his quotes, and you could tell he was pretty impressed. So this is a guy that I think, especially, with the fact that Dan Lanning, I'm sure that there are shared traits that they look for between Dan Lanning and Kirby Smart. I think they saw him as someone that could help boost the depth a little bit, add another body there in the secondary. I think it's an addition that, when we all saw it, I think even us on this call were sort of like, wow, where did that come from? But, Kipp, I was going to see if you agree. Like, to me, once you kind of step back and look at the potential, and again, it's the fact that this is a young guy, I thought this pickup made a lot of sense for Georgia.
You have a spot in your roster. You have a scholarship left in the month of June, and you have a chance to add to your secondary, knowing that Kirby Smart would have 70, 80 scholarships filled in that secondary if he could. He's not going to turn down that opportunity. And then when you kind of peel it back a little bit and understand that Colin Gill is still 18 years old and will be 18, I think going into August, if I remember correctly. He's basically a 2024 recruit. So you could take the fact that he did, that he redshirted last season and just, wipe that slate clean. He's coming in basically with the other freshmen right now, but he's coming in having spent a year in a program that's built the exact same as Kirby Smart's. So I just think that that's a no-brainer. And with the transfer portal, again, I mean, like, if it doesn't work out for him in 2 years and he's not cracked the 2 deep, then I don't think, both parties are going to lose anything from this situation. But at the same time, I just think you look back at a guy like Tyke Smith, a guy that spent a lot of time developing in Georgia's program. People wondered for a bit, is he going to get passed up? And yet this last season, he made more plays on defense than anybody on the roster. So I think right there, you just know that with the physical development he has coming in 6 foot, 215 pounds, the fact that, again, Georgia might seem deep on the surface, but again, I just think it's a situation where you saw in the spring that, especially at the safety and star position, I don't think Kirby Smart was happy with where they were as far as depth, as far as physicality. I just think that was a position that we knew was going to be an emphasis in the transfer portal. They added Jake Pope there, but at the same time, if you can add another guy to give yourself more competition at the star and possibly safety positions, he's going to take it. Just knowing that, you never know which guys are going to be gone after the season. Again, you have a scholarship available. This isn't really a difficult thing to figure out. If you have one, then use it, because I've covered a Georgia team again that's had less than 70 players on scholarship before. It's not the ideal situation. So if you got one, I mean, you use all of them, and that's what Kirby Smart's doing here.
Jimmy Thompson on Facebook said, "Who's next?" And that's going to be the big question. And that's what we're going to be following in these next few weeks. And as Ben mentioned earlier, follow along with us. Go subscribe over at Dawgs 24/7 if you haven't already. 60% off deal. It is going to end at midnight on Tuesday night. So get in there and stay woke and get ready for what's going to be another busy summer. We are going to take a quick break, come back, talk about what was another very busy visit weekend for Georgia, look ahead to the one that's coming, and then, of course, talk a little Georgia baseball. Ben, you look at this time of year, looking at mid-June, there's a lot of guys coming in, a lot of visits happening. And as we've seen, it's been some pretty productive visits based on some of the commits Georgia's gotten. Tell us about what happened this past weekend with some of the guys that were in town and just anything that you feel like has stood out from some of the conversations, some of what you've learned from the most recent visits.
Well, I mean, again, the two biggest takeaways up to this point were obviously Christian Garrett and Todd Robinson coming out and committing publicly. Other guys that I think that Georgia did a really good job with this weekend. I don't know if I'd go so far as to say I think that's going to be the choice or I have specific commitment dates of when they're going to do it. But 4-star wide receiver CJ Wiley has been a recruitment that I've been watching really closely this spring because I know he is a high priority for Georgia. And at various points in this recruitment, I think that because of the fact that both of his parents played college sports at LSU's been seen as a big threat. I think that USC got him on a visit earlier this month, did a really good job. Florida State's going to get him on a visit at the end of the month. They've done a really good job. Auburn has already hosted him on an official visit earlier this spring. All these teams have, been competitive, but just from talking to people around this over the last couple of weeks or so, I think that Georgia has been trending in the right direction all spring long. I think that James Coley coming on board and making him feel like a clear-cut priority has been a huge move in the right direction for Georgia. Now, that LSU official visit that a lot of people have probably been dreading is coming up this next weekend. So it's hard to say definitively on June 10th without him having taken that 14th to 16th visit to LSU that Georgia's in the best position, but that is what I would say coming out of the official visit. I think that Georgia's doing a really, bang up job at wide receiver right now when it comes to Coley's first cycle recruiting. I mean, a lot of times you see it take a while for a new position coach's board to really materialize. I think we've seen that a little bit with defensive back. I think to some extent, even though it's a lot less spots, we've seen that at running back. But I think that Coley has really just hit the ground running. A lot of that is because he was already recruiting to Texas A&M and South Carolina. So there was a lot of overlap when it comes to relationships with guys in the 2025 class. So we'll see what we hear moving forward with CJ Wiley, but he's someone that I again think Georgia has done a really, really good job with. I would be remiss if I didn't bring up 5-star line or offensive lineman David Sanders. He's probably one of the recruits that we get the most questions about coming into the weekend. If you were to say who's the biggest official visitor coming in, I think I might have said CJ Wiley just because I think that he really is that good of a wide receiver. That said, David Sanders is way, way up there as well. And there have been different viewed leaders at different times. And I don't think that David has ever come out and said this team specifically is leading my recruitment. He's a little bit too calculated to do that. But Clemson has been viewed that way at times. Georgia has been viewed that way at times. I think most recently Tennessee and or Ohio State have been viewed that way. I get the sense that coming out of the visit to Georgia this past weekend, there's no clear leader. I do think that Georgia, Tennessee, and Ohio State do have sort of the 3-team advantage at the top right now. Not to say that Clemson is completely out of things. He grew up a Clemson fan. He officially visited there first. But again, anytime you're leaving that Clemson visit without having committed and closed things down, I think that it's always a little bit of a concern on Clemson's side of things. And so I would put those 3 teams at the top. The only, the main concern for Georgia is he has those Ohio State and Tennessee visits coming up. So he hasn't been there yet. The fact that there's not this, obvious sense that Georgia's in the driver's seat coming out of the visit and that the others need to play catch up might be a little bit of concern, but I think that also probably has more to do with just the approach and patience that the family has taken throughout this whole process, that they're not going to get on too many visit highs like some guys might. On the offensive line, there is a prospect, Dontrell Glover from Langston Hughes in Atlanta. He told me it was really right after the spring game when he visited. He'd been on 2 visits that week, that Georgia was starting to really make a push. They saw him as a potential center in this class. I think he could really be center or guard, just sort of depending on some of the other guys that they elect to bring in this class as well. Numbers are getting thinner on the offensive line now that there have been so many visitors over the last couple of weekends, even though, there haven't been people that have necessarily come out and committed. There are guys that Georgia feels pretty good about. And so Dontrell Glover's another one that I think, he's probably going to make a decision July 1st. I would be pretty surprised at this point in time if Georgia's not that decision, but he does have a couple more visits. And so I know that this time of year is the time of year that Georgia, looks back at their first 2 official visit weekends and they say, all right, this went really well. This went really well, but what if things kind of go sideways here towards the end of the month? What are the backup plans? Who else do you need to make a push for? Who have you maybe not gotten firm enough answers for from the last 2 weekends that you need to make pushes at those position groups these last 2? But Dontrell Glover is someone that I think is trending in the right direction as well. Again, there were 15 guys both of the last 2 weekends, so we could probably sit here and give 3 to 5 minutes on each of the players. But those are the guys that I would like to high point probably.
I wanted to bring this up. You mentioned Dontrell, and I saw Bo Hewley, who also went to Langston. There were some photos with him. And I saw a few other players. I think Mason Short, who's committed, he was in there with David Sanders at one point. I know this isn't anything new. This isn't anything groundbreaking. But Ben, how big do you feel like that is that Georgia's getting current players involved on some of these visits? Letting them interact with some of these guys that they really want to bring in, and trying to foster some of those relationships as they look at recruiting and trying to get these guys to wind up committing to Georgia.
Well, it's something Georgia really leans into. I mean, they definitely want to make sure that these recruits are feeling like they are part of the team. I mean, Georgia has, I think we've talked about this in a few different respects. Georgia has, I don't want to say shifted its approach, but it feels like Georgia has, again, leaned into the fact that it is a hard place to play football. It is a hard place to practice. It's not going to be easy. They aren't getting too caught up. They still do the photo shoots. They do a lot of those things, but they're not getting too caught up in the glitz and glamour of everything. They really want to make it clear to these guys what playing football at the University of Georgia is like. And I think just from talking to recruits and their families, one of the ways that Georgia has probably done that the best is kind of sending them off to have time with Georgia players where they can ask those questions freely and where they're going to get fair answers. I mean, I know you weren't asking about him specifically, but I just went to go see 5-star USC commit Justice Terry earlier today. And that's what he brought up to me when he was on the Georgia official visit, that being able to spend some time with Michael Williams and really ask him the real about what is it like, what I have to expect? What are some of the things that you would give me advice on were I to come to Georgia? And I think that those are the moments that really help define how these recruits are thinking. Like, yeah, the conversations with coaches and understanding the offenses and seeing the history and past awards and all these things, like that's going to factor in. Obviously, the relationships with coaches is going to play a factor, but also understanding what it's like to be a football player at a place is a big thing. And I think that Georgia has really brought that in. I mean, that first official visit weekend with Lagonza Hayward, I was told one of the big reasons why it was such a successful weekend is because DeMello Jones and Andre Evans and KJ Bolden and Ellis Robinson really took him under their wing and made him feel like one of the guys for that weekend. And that coming into that weekend, Lagonza couldn't really envision himself at Georgia, and leaving that weekend, he absolutely envisioned himself at Georgia just because of that relationship that he built with those guys. And so I think that that's huge. It might be a lame thing, but one of my favorite things to ask recruits when I talk to them after visits is who their player host was, just because when you've covered other guys, so you know sort of what their tendencies are and how they operated during their recruitments, and then you see who Georgia chose to pair with some of these guys, I always find it fascinating. And I also tend to think that Georgia does an exceptional job with who they choose to pair up with recruits as their player host. And you're not just hanging out with your player host, but Georgia's usually, choosing those guys for a reason.
Shane Daniel on YouTube asked, what position is Todd Robinson going to play at Georgia? I talked a little bit about that earlier in this podcast. Going to be a defensive back, but as Ben noted, they want to try to get him involved on the offensive side. He's a guy that's made a lot of plays down there in Valdosta, and I'm sure that they're going to try to take advantage of that once he gets to Georgia. Kipp, I want to ask you about CJ Wiley. Ben gave us some good intel there, thoughts on him. And again, big LSU visit coming up. But if Georgia was able to land a receiver of his caliber, just how big would that be? It feels like when you look at all the success Georgia's had in recent years, and they've had, a handful of pretty high-profile receivers, but it continues to feel like receiver is the thing they get knocked for the most on the recruiting trail.
It's definitely what the fans talk about. I mean, they just that elite wide receiver, even though, again, they just sent one into as close as you can get to a first rounder without being one, and Ladd McConkey, a guy that everyone wondered, what Georgia was doing when they added him. You had anonymous coaches saying this guy can't even fill out his pads, and now he's going to be doing that at NFL level. But I think, the wide receiver position is obviously going to be a huge discussion because it's that passing attack that Georgia now has, but, the tight end position was utilized a lot when they had the best college football tight end ever in Brock Bowers. So still people are trying to, scratch that itch of getting 1,000-yard receiver. So they want to continue to look for anything Georgia hasn't been able to do yet. And, other than Terrence Edwards, that's that one thing, that Georgia doesn't have. And I think so that just makes that position just even more intriguing. And now I think James Coley has a chance to hit a grand slam here. And by grand slam, I mean, honestly, he's got a chance to have 4 wide receivers in this class that any one of these guys would be considered, an exceptional possible wide receiver 1 or wide receiver 2 down the road. And so I really like where he is already early in June with his main targets. The fact that he's got a guy in Thomas Blackshear in the fold right now that we've talked about. We love this guy and what he brings to the table. The fact that they're trending right now, with their other in-state target, I think you look at what Wiley brings to the table. The size is just ridiculous. That picture with Drake London today, I'm like, okay, you know what? This guy's a legit 6'4" and off the charts athleticism at this point, standing next to Drake London. Initially I was like, wait, do we have Drake London's measurements wrong with the Falcons? And then, you just also look at Travis Smith, similar measurables. So that's always been the case with Travis Smith at Westlake, is that, he checks off all the boxes you look for in a catch radius guy, and he's got a lot of upside. You really like where Georgia is there. And I just think you take those guys, if he's got a chance to land those guys, and then we think Georgia's in a really good spot with Taylor as well. I think they're trending right now with him to where we're basically on a possible commit watch with him right now. If he announces a decision at any point, we like where Georgia stands. And that's basically just 4 exceptional talents that Georgia's in right now. I think this is definitely just a chance for James Coley to say, I'm back. Did you miss me? And I think that's how this is going to go. That's where I think it goes as of right now. And so with CJ Wiley, I think this is a recruitment that, before James Coley came on board, they were in pretty good shape, but I wouldn't have said that, this guy's definitely going to Georgia. Now, I think, if he comes out of this LSU official visit uncommitted, I mean, my crystal ball is with Georgia. That's kind of the one thing I'm waiting on. If he comes out of that official visit still uncommitted, I think the Dawgs get the projection for me, and I would be putting in a crystal ball, next Monday or Tuesday after that. You let the visit high wear off, but I think at that point, you got to feel really good where Georgia stands. And Ben, correct me if I'm wrong. I think there's the Kirby Smart 7-on-7s this week.
Yep,
and
on Thursday.
And I don't see a situation where Milton's not in that 7-on-7.
Yep, they are in that 7-on-7.
So that's another opportunity for Georgia to get CJ Wiley on campus right before he heads to Baton Rouge. I mean, this is, again, we're not playing checkers here. I think this is just how, the whole month is setting up really well for James Coley. And I just think as of right now, this class is as good as a wide receiver class as you can ask for, the way that things are trending as of right now.
Yeah, I think as Kipp mentioned, we're all going to be watching what happens or doesn't happen out of that LSU visit. And, kept talking about James Coley, showing what he's capable of doing. Kind of made me think of the John Wick gif, I think I'm back. So, might have an opportunity to break that one out if things break Georgia's way. Ben, let's preview the weekend to come. We know that, again, there's going to be several guys visiting Athens. What can you tell us about what we're watching for this upcoming weekend, and what intrigues you the most going into this weekend?
Well, just like last week, I mean, some of the names that were on the official visit list at the beginning of the week didn't end up making the trip. I mean, Chuck McDonald was an example that ended up committing to Alabama, so Georgia didn't, feel the need for him to come on that visit to Georgia, and like he felt the same way as well. So it's always possible that there are names, and Jonte Gilbert officially visited last weekend on Monday. Jonte Gilbert, not only was he not planning on having Georgia as an official visit, he had just recently released a top 7 coming off of a camp to Georgia that Georgia was not in. And so these things can change pretty quickly this time of year, especially with people adding to and canceling visits. Javon Boggs from Florida is a wide receiver that announced yesterday he's no longer taking his Georgia official visit this upcoming weekend, and he's really narrowed his recruitment down to 2. So those types of things are likely to happen. And between the time that you're hearing this, some of those things might have happened. So, subscribe to Dawgs 24/7. But the names that are really most intriguing to me, I'm going to start with, let's start with, there's going to be 2 Georgia commitments that are going to be on their official visit this weekend. Big defensive lineman, Stephon Shivers. Again, you're going to hear a lot of Jordan Davis comparisons associated with him just because of body type, but someone that's just not going to be talked about a lot because he's going to be, by nature of sort of the role that he plays in a defensive line, he's going to be probably the lowest rated defensive lineman that Georgia ends up signing in this class, I would think. And I think that that's a really good sign if Stephon Shivers is your lowest rated defensive lineman. I'm really excited to see what he's able to do at Georgia, though I do know there are a couple other programs like Ole Miss that are still working to flip him as well. And then Mason Short, who was just on an unofficial last weekend to help out recruiting David Sanders. He's coming on his official visit this upcoming weekend. But of the uncommitted group, Bryce Davis, the edge rusher, 4-star edge rusher out of North Carolina, goes to the same high school that Jamal Jarrett went to, and Georgia's recruited other guys, Travis Shaw, Terrell Anderson, and past recruiting classes out of Grimsley High School as well. He's been someone that Georgia has really been in full control of this recruitment for a while. I mean, I first talked with Bryce end of last June at the Future 50 down in Florida. And he said then that Georgia was probably one of his favorites. He was coming back for the cookout at the end of July, came back for that cookout at the end of July. Georgia was one of his favorites. He came for a game in the fall. He's come for a junior day. He's now coming back for his official visit. And, he has a July 20th commitment date, so I don't want to jump the gun on when he's going to make a decision. We do know that Georgia's coming off of a weekend where they had a guy coming into the visit with a July 20th official commitment date, and he committed before he even left campus on Sunday. And so Bryce Davis is someone that I think you could potentially put on commit watch if Georgia just wanted to go ahead and bring someone into the class. It might be a little bit trickier there just because spots are tighter on the at edge than they are along the defensive line. And we know that Georgia's still recruiting Isaiah Gibson as well. And they've recently extended an offer to Julius Hawley as an in-state guy. So the edge position is sort of taking shape. And I think this weekend with Bryce Davis is going to be a really important one. I'm fascinated. This is a guy that I have not talked about a whole lot. Jamarian Morrow, running back from Tennessee. He's listed as an athlete. He's someone that Josh Crawford was recruiting as a wide receiver to Georgia Tech, but he really likes him more as a running back. So when he came over to Georgia, he really started to push things for him at running back. Again, Georgia brought in Bo Jackson on an official visit in May. He has since committed to Ohio State. I'm confident that Georgia is going to continue recruiting Bo Jackson, but I think really when an Ohio State pushes for an in-state guy like that, it's going to be really hard to get him. And so I think Georgia is going to have to look elsewhere. Morrow's not someone that I've talked about a lot, but he has someone that has visited Georgia a bunch and that has a really, really strong relationship with Josh Crawford. I'm just interested to see what approach Georgia takes. I mean, Usmani Chroma is coming on a visit the following weekend. They've obviously already got Bo Walker committed, but I think that Morrow is someone that, Georgia, I could see Georgia making a push for this weekend. And if they do, I'm equally interested to see how receptive Morrow would be to coming off the board. So that's a fascinating one just because with Todd Robinson flipping over to the defensive side, Bo Jackson committing to Ohio State, the running back options beyond Bo Walker aren't necessarily as aplenty as some of the other position groups right now. Now, I am confident that Georgia's going to land one of these running backs. I mean, the way that they've been recruiting them, I think that they'll get one. It's just a matter of who. Dijon Lee, Christian Gass, those are a couple of guys that I've had in mock classes at times throughout this spring. Hard to say prior to the official visits exactly where they stand coming in. But again, that's what makes these official visits so critical is we're going to find out in some cases by next Sunday evening, exactly what's going on with some of them. If we're looking for a headline visitor this weekend, the headline visitor is probably Alabama commit Luke Metz. People eat that headline up anytime that an Alabama commits on campus. We've already talked about Mason Short and Dontrell Glover during this. Those are two guys that decommitted from Alabama on back-to-back days, and I feel pretty strongly about being in Georgia's class along the offensive line when it's all said and done. Luke Metz is another Alabama commit that Georgia's recently offered, testing the waters on, in-state guy. With the way that Georgia's recruiting linebackers right now, already brought in Zaden Walker. Things are feeling pretty good, but cautiously optimistic about Tavion Wallace and Ty Jackson coming out of last weekend. Got Christian Gass this weekend, Nathaniel Owusu-Boateng this weekend, but Luke Metz is one of the newer names added to the list. And so that's a fascinating one for me just to kind of start to find out where does he really fit on Georgia's board compared to these other guys that have been there for longer.
Kipp, is there anything in particular you're looking for this upcoming weekend? Ben ran through a lot of the guys that are going to be on campus. Is there anything in particular you're going to be keeping an eye out for?
I don't know. My head's still spinning from all that. I felt like I was reading a Stay Wolk there. I have to take it all in. But, yeah, trying to find some clarity at certain positions is kind of where we're at in June. And I think the edge position is one of those where, you didn't get the straight flip from Isaiah Gibson coming out of the official visit, but at the same time, Georgia's got reason to be pretty optimistic about where they stand with Isaiah Gibson, knowing that he's publicly committed to USC, but knowing that, the Warner Robins edge is still very high in Georgia. His social media since the visit has been very pro-Georgia as well, and they're probably going to get him on campus, several more times this fall. So that's one where Georgia's probably going to have to say he might not flip publicly anytime soon. We probably need to go ahead and just set aside a spot for him in this class. Okay, well, if you do that, that's 2 edge spots where you're probably taking 3 edges in this class. That's just my guess. It could go to 4, but we'll just say for now, knowing that they're just fighting for all these final spots at the end, that they may take 3 guys at that position in this class. So that makes this weekend even more intriguing. When you have a guy like Bryce Davis, you've recruited for a long time, you probably want to come out of this visit knowing where you stand with him, because he's not the only edge in town this weekend. You got Julius Hawley from Alpharetta coming into town, and his recruitment's blown up over the last month and a half. Georgia being one of the several programs to extend offers, coming off a Michigan official visit, but Alabama, Ole Miss, Texas A&M, they've all jumped into the mix alongside Georgia recently. I think, he's another guy that's, I want to know where maybe he is on the board. If he's a guy that showed up and impressed the Georgia coaches in person, well, that kind of holds a little bit of a different value, especially when it's just, later in the cycle. So I just think coming out of this weekend, knowing where things stand with that edge position of, possibly the final edge spot, knowing they just had guys like, Jared Smith on campus. I just think it's really intriguing to figure out where they go with that potentially final spot, because again, edge rusher is just a position where Georgia needs to not necessarily improve the room, but continue to stack what they've done the last two cycles, because it did, it did get a little thin after, you had guys like Nolan Smith go to the league. There was, there's been a little bit of a perceived drop off at that position. And I think you got to continue to keep that talent level back to where it was when they had their early championship run.
Our buddy Stephen Fowler just commented on YouTube and checked in and said, "We not done yet." And I think that he is correct. And to keep up with all that, be sure to stay glued to Dawgs 24/7 throughout this week, especially when you're looking to this visit weekend, because there will be a lot of good stuff there. Well, guys, let's wrap up this episode with a little Georgia baseball talk. Wanted to mention for some of the people who might have missed it on social media. So I was at the game on Saturday. It's the first Georgia baseball game I've covered in, I think, 8 years. And I made the mistake of mentioning that because it did not go Georgia's way. That opening game of the Super Regional against NC State, Georgia won 18-1, and had a lot of people very kindly suggest no force, nothing ugly. So why don't you watch game 2 from home? Just don't go to Foley. It didn't go well the last time you were there. Well, I watched from home on Sunday, and Georgia wins 11-2, and it sets up a series-deciding game. If you're listening to this if you're listening to this podcast, it happened on Monday night. But there's a spot in Omaha up for grabs. So, fellas, I'm just going to set you guys up, and I'll throw it to Ben first. What do you make of these first 2 games? And give me a prediction on how this thing plays out tonight, Georgia and NC State.
Well, my number one takeaway is that Jordan Hill is bad for the state of Georgia baseball. I mean, you go to the first game 1, Georgia loses by 17. You get season tickets to the Braves this season, and they, lose their best pitcher, their best player. The Phillies start to run away with the division by June. So if you're a fan of baseball in the state of Georgia, do whatever it takes. I'm not encouraging force, but if it requires force to keep Jordan away from the baseball park, I'm not going to be the one to stop you from doing so. My real takeaway would be it's the epitome of baseball. You lose a game by 17 runs. It feels like you're just no match for your opponent. And then 2 innings into the next game, you've already, basically reversed given them the reverse treatment of everything that happened the day before. And so I think that's what makes for an interesting rubber match. I hope it's a better game. I mean, I'm sure a lot of Georgia fans out there hope it's not. I hope that they probably hope it's exactly like game 2. But I do think that the home environment, the fact that you were able to just completely rear view mirror the game 1 and game 2, you've got, what I think are, 2 of the best hitters left in the entire, baseball tournament right now, in Corey Collins and Charlie Condon. These games a lot of times come down to who takes advantage of relief pitching at the end of them. And I just think that Georgia's lineup is top to bottom, going to be too good to compete with. So I'll put on the red and black colored lenses and I'll say, are we doing score predictions?
Yeah. Oh yeah. We have to.
I'll say Georgia 9-4.
I wanted to mention, Ben talking about, hey, you lose by 17 and you turn and you win by 9. I mean, I thought Wes Johnson, was really even killed after that first game and said, one of the great things about the sport is what happened the day before has no carryover. It's not like golf and you have a bad round and all of a sudden, well, you're trying to dig yourself out of a hole. And Georgia did a good job of shaking that one off and played excellent on Sunday. Kipp, give us a prediction. How do you see Monday night's game playing out?
I mean, I got to look at what's happened so far in this college baseball postseason. The fact that almost all of these games, you've had at least one team scoring 10, 11 runs. And so I think that you're going to have to hit that mark in this game. I don't think it's going to change. I think especially with, everyone's just going to empty out their bullpen, use every arm they can, Georgia included. I think Zach Harris is on the mound. I don't expect him or any Georgia pitcher to see the lineup twice. So for Georgia to win this game, they got to do exactly what they did the last time they were in Game 3 against NC State in 2008, which is just put up a 9 spot in the first inning. And that's exactly what I'm going to predict. The Georgia just gets on the board, gets up big quick. I'm not going to say it's 9, but I'm going to say that they give themselves a healthy lead. They bat through the order in the first inning, and they come out with an 11-6 victory. I do think that this is going to be a game where one of these teams is going to jump out to a huge lead, and then it's just trying to hold on down the stretch. And I think Georgia does that. I think, again, this lineup is built to mash, and I think that's exactly what they're going to do against NC State and move on to an extremely difficult matchup at the next level. Kentucky is this NC State team, I think, with just the lineup, the way that, everyone on the lineup, you matched up perfectly with Georgia's pitching. I think Kentucky is similar. So I just think that's a team that's really built basically the blueprint to beat a Georgia team. So it's going to be an extremely hard matchup, but I don't think Georgia fans are going to care about that. They just want to move on. And I think I like them to do that. Like I said, they're going to jump out quick and win this one 11-6.
That's sort of been the story of the first 2 games. NC State jumped out in the second inning and set the stage. And then Georgia did a good job in game 2 of getting some runs early and really putting the pressure on NC State. I'm going to say Georgia wins 6-4. I think that the runs aren't going to come quite as easily for either team as it has the last couple of days. A lot of pressure. I think you're going to see, some tense moments, some tense situations. I'm hoping, like Ben said, that this game is an entertaining one. The last couple, we've known by about the 5th inning how it was going to play out. But I think it's set to be a really fun one. It is going to start for those watching live in a few minutes over on ESPN. So we're going to wrap it up right there to get ready to go watch this game. Be sure to take advantage, again, as we've mentioned, 60% off over on Dawgs 24/7. That is going to end midnight Eastern time on Tuesday night. Go get subscribed there. There's all kinds of good intel and good stories that we've got cooking up over there. Go to Dawgs 24/7 on YouTube, subscribe where you get all these podcast episodes. And once we get back in season, there will be Kirby Smart press conferences and also player interviews. And then go follow us on TikTok. We got a lot of videos from these podcasts and some other stuff that we got cooking up there as well. So for Kipp Adams and Ben Wolk, I'm Jordan Hill. Until next time, take care, everybody.